Alhamdulillah, Jazakumullah khair. Especially with the emphasis on this camp on the Muslim family. For the Muslim family is the most important institution in Islam, and the survival of Muslims in Britain and elsewhere is very much dependent on the health and functioning of that family. And since we are speaking about the Islamic family, not any family, with all the other definitions that we heard of and other definitions offered in the population conference in Cairo, since we talk about an Islamic family, it follows that its objective and its direction should be part of the broader objective of Islam, that is to establish the Khilafah or trusteeship on this earth. It follows from this that any articulation of the role of the Muslim family or the pattern of relationship between its members must be based on the primary sources of Islam. But as Brother Munir said, in this introductory session, it would appear to me, and hope to you also, that any discussion of the details of the family, the specifics, engagement roles, nature of relationship, has to be grounded on our own perception of how men and women stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I hope you forgive me for some of the interruptions from cough. It's just a sort of dry cough. I hope it doesn't bother you much. In fact, from the vantage point of receiving lots of calls and dealing with lots of Muslims in North America and elsewhere, it appears to me that lots of family problems, relational problem in particular, relate to the way people understand the role of men and women in Islamic society. In order to facilitate the presentation and hopefully make you able to follow best, there is an outline that I hope you make sure that you get one. There were some on the chairs already, because I'll follow that with two modifications. That brochure actually is intended for general distribution to Muslims and non-Muslims by way of just giving an outline of the how men and women stand in the sight of Allah. But I'll do in my presentation two modifications to that. One is that the points that I believe that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, I'll mention it in a brief way without getting into detailed quotations. But then I'll stop on some of the points that I believe are more controversial and troublesome sometimes when you get into discussions. And I might even add for each of the sections a few additional points also of the more difficult questions faced. This way I hope you will have some discussion which goes beyond the fundamentals, but in the meantime it follows the fundamentals to make it easier for everyone in different levels of understanding to follow. As I mentioned earlier, the understanding and configuration of the role of Muslim family would have to be based on the primary sources of Islam in the proper way and methodology of interpretation. And that's what's covered in Roman 1 in that outline. And basically I just want to emphasize 5 points. Oftentimes observers, especially non-Muslims, make a big mix between what Muslims practice as individuals, families or communities and what Islam teaches. And sometimes they tend to think of Islam as a monolithic type of religion where all Muslims practice every detail in exactly the same way. Not religiously, that's understandable, but in every cultural respect, which is a big mistake. There are basic things, there are a basic core that join all Muslims, but there are diverse cultures also in all continents, all races, and one has to be quite clear on those distinctions that not everything that is found in the so-called Muslim cultures is necessarily Islamic. Second point, is that it is very important for us to focus on what you might call the normative, the foundational, based on the sources of Islam, because that is the criteria or criterion that should be used to judge and evaluate the actions of Muslims. So it's not just a sort of theory, it is a basis to evaluate how we are faring as Muslims in our practices. My third point is that oftentimes you hear people saying, Islam says this, Islam doesn't allow this. And oftentimes what is meant by Islam is my particular interpretation or understanding of Islam, or the particular sheikh or scholar that I follow. And that's why I find it very important to make a distinction between the primary sources of Islam, revelatory, which are based on revelation, which are only two. The Qur'an, which is the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, dictated verbatim to the Prophet, it's not his words. And Sunnah, sound Sunnah, because of course, the degrees of Hadith, the sound or authentic Sunnah, or Hadith, the saying of the Prophet, because he received revelation only in meaning, using his own words to express it, but its source, after all, is revelatory. The Qur'an doesn't show us how to pray, for example. It was revelation to the Prophet to teach us. So it has the same authority, but it's not verbatim words as the Qur'an is. This, on one hand, should be distinguished from opinions by scholars and jurists throughout history. Mind you, there are certain areas, limited areas, where you have always unanimous opinion of all jurists, in which case the primary sources and secondary sources perfectly merge. But these are limited sources or limited issues. For example, the fact that prayer is required, that there are 5 daily prayers, and the number of units or rak'ahs is that much. There's no difference whatsoever on that. So what the jurist really is saying is not an opinion. It is something which is so clearly founded on the primary sources of Islam that there could be no difference whatsoever. But I must say that these are limited area, because even in the prayer itself, where to put your hands, like Brother Munir said earlier, whether you can combine Maghrib and Isha, some mazhab say you can shorten prayer but not combine, the distance for travel, these are details where there is difference of opinion. And we should never equate an opinion of any scholar, no matter how great or learned he or she might be, to put it exactly on the same level and authority like the Qur'an and Sunnah and say the Shaykh said this, period. Because there is nobody who's ma'soom, who's totally infallible in terms of conveying the message except the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Is that clear? I hope I'm not getting into very ambiguous, but we'll get through this methodology very quickly, but it's important. Number 4, even primary sources of Islam, and that's the reason why scholars differ. Even if you take a text from the Qur'an and Sunnah, sometimes there are problems of interpretation. Some people may even come up with erroneous interpretations, especially those outside of Islam who are just digging for something rather than trying to understand Islam for what it is. And that's why I'm suggesting, instead of talking about the negative, the positive side, what is the proper methodology of understanding or interpreting any text? Because you'll be confronted with people say, look, your book says this, the Quran says this, it's right there, and give you his own understanding of it. The first thing is that whenever we look at a text, we have to put it in the context. Suppose there is a hadith that speak about women, or an ayah in the Quran that deal with the issue of women. On the surface, it might give one meaning, but if you relate it to the objective of the Quran, its message, its overall teaching about women, for example, or that particular issue, you'll find that this interpretation is quite faulty. You get my point? So you have to find out what's the overall message and thrust of the Quran and Sunnah. B, sometimes lack of awareness of some occasions or incidents in history surrounding the revelation of the ayah or the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ could lead to very erroneous interpretation. So it sheds some light on its true meaning. Thirdly, oftentimes many of the Western writers, non-Muslim writers, are not very familiar with hadith or saying of the Prophet, hadith literature. And very few really bother to study hadith carefully. And oftentimes when they try to attack Islam and Muslims or attack the Quran, say, look, the ayah says this. But if one really were to collect other texts of hadith relating to that subject, you will find that it has a totally different meaning from the lexical or literal translation that sometimes they try to present. Finally, my fifth point, I leave the sixth, it's so obvious, is that that even is not enough to have proper interpretation. These are essential. But in addition to this, when we interpret something for Islam, one aspect or the other, it has to be also put into the context or broader world view of Islam. Its vision about the Creator, the nature of the human, the universe, how we relate to the universe. And again, this gives a sort of proper railing to make that interpretation. Well, I hope that this did not put you to sleep being somewhat methodological, but like I say, as we move on, you can find specific examples where this could be applicable. And so far as the subdivision, which is provided in this pamphlet and also for your information, inshallah, very soon a small book about 67 pages is coming up. It's called Gender Equity in Islam, that tackles some of the controversial issues on Muslim women. And the title actually is Equity. I'll comment on the word equity. Why not equality, for example, when we come to the economic issues. So basically in the book, as well as in that outline, I tried to follow a relatively simple framework to follow by looking at the spiritual, economic, social, and political and legal aspects in how men and women stand before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Like I promised you again, you must have heard lots of lectures, read so many booklets and books on the issue of women in Islam. So I'll go lightly on things that I think you know. My apology to the sister, I promised to push that, but my apology. Well, first of all, there is no question, looking at the Qur'an, noticing immediately that the spiritual and human nature of men and women are the same before Allah, that anyone who does good deeds and is a believer would get the same reward, man or woman, that both gendered are described in the Qur'an as endowed with the divine breath that Allah breathed into the human. It doesn't say man or woman, the human, something of His spirit. That according to the Qur'an in Surah 17, Allah says, indeed we dignified or honored the children of Adam, Bani Adam. By the way, some translators translate like sons of Adam. That's a mistaken translation. Bani Adam means children of Adam. Actually, it's more accurate to say it this way. I think those of you who are familiar with scriptures preceding the revelation of the Quran are familiar with how it describes the role and responsibility of women tempting man to eat from the forbidden tree, something that has no trace whatsoever in the Quran at all. In Surah Al-A'raf in particular, Surah number 7, it describes Adam and Eve as equally responsible, equally repenting, and equally forgiven. As far as the religious duties, which is number 5 in your outline, it's the same for men and women. Nobody says that men can pray, women can't, or fast. The duties is essentially the same. If there are concessions for women, like not requiring them to fast when they are in the later stages of pregnancy or suckling, that's not really to say that they're not qualified for that spiritual exercise, but it's a concession out of consideration of their femininity, their interest, and the interest of their children. But the duty, the 5 pillars of Islam and other moral requirements are shared by both. Some even Muslim translators, unfortunately, when they translate the ayah in the Quran, excuse me, that deal with qawama or leadership of the husband of the family, they interpret that as superiority. In fact, that contradicts the explicit statement in the Quran in Surah 49, Ayah 13, Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, the most honored of you in the sight of Allah is the most pious. That has nothing to do with gender, wealth, or color, or whatever. So there's no basis at all to claim any sense of superiority. You could say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala endowed different genders, males and females, with different things, but this is not superiority. Overall, there might be some distinction in one side or the other in a given aspect, but there is no overall superiority that I am a superior human to you because I am a female or male, for that matter. But I just address a couple of more points. You must have confronted these questions. Why is it that there are no women prophets in history? That has nothing to do with their spirituality or worshipfulness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It is a practical question pertaining to the mission of the Prophet. And if you study the history of prophets, not only from the Quran, even reading the Bible, for example, you notice how abused the prophets and messengers were. They were attacked, they were assaulted, they were cursed, they were, like Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, stoned even, and bled from the stoning of people. And obviously for a woman, especially if she's pregnant and she's a messenger of Allah and she has to put up with all of that, it doesn't go with her femininity. Furthermore, prophets are supposed to convey the message also, are supposed to appeal to people, not necessarily to agree with what people are thinking, but at least to be effective in communicating with people. And up until the mission even of the last Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, we find all communities, the Arabs, the Hebrew people, Israelites and others, were largely paternalistic type of society. And in these societies, of course, they would be much less likely to listen to the advice of a prophet if he's a female. Indeed, they made the life of male prophets very miserable even for male prophets. How about even a female prophet? And the idea is to get them to believe, to get them to accept. I must say, however, something that really attracted my attention is that the Prophet ﷺ said that some of my Sahaba are like Israelite prophets. Because you see, the biblical definition of prophet is a little bit loose. So he said some of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ are in the status of prophets in the biblical sense, you might say. And as you know, the companions of the Prophet included males and females for that matter. Another aspect that relates to prophethood as people who are living in the West, some of you might have been asked that question. Can a woman become a priest or minister like other liberal churches? And say, you see, even churches are developing and you people are so rigid. Can a woman be a priest in Islam? In response to that, we have to be clear, first of all, that to start with, there is no priesthood in Islam. There is no intermediary between Allah and the humans. There could be a leader for prayer, but there is no really priesthood as an institution, the way it's understood in Judaism and Christianity. Number one. Number two, sometimes people get caught up with titles rather than essence. Because if you look at the role of a priest or minister in a typical church, you find that they perform a number of functions. Education for children, adults, counseling, marriage counseling, or even non-marriage counseling, counseling for people for questions and difficulties. And in fact, in all of these functions, we find that there is no text in Islamic law that says women cannot do this function in proper Islamic context. The Muslim men and women can advise each other, can counsel each other in the proper Islamic framework. Education, either gender can educate the other. When we speak about spiritual and human nature of the genders, there is full equality. It's not equity. There is full equality before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we deal with economic, social, political roles, functions, complementarity of roles between genders, it does not mean like some feminists, for example, call for that they have to be equal in each and everything. If men are drafted in the army, women should be drafted in the army. Exactly the same kind of. That's too superficial. So if you insist on equality on each and every item, you might actually end up with inequity, with injustice actually being done. But it makes a lot more sense in Islamic perspective to think more of equity, that there could be variations in financial rights, someone gets more here but less there, somebody gets less there but compensated, so that the totality would be the same. Social functions, social roles, political roles could also be equivalent in total, but not necessarily tit for tat. I thought that this remark perhaps might describe the spirit of what's coming. More specifically, when you get to Roman 3, which is in the second panel, economic aspect, of course the question of economic right, you people in Britain here should appreciate it, because Britain was among the very first European countries to recognize the right of married women to own properties on their own without the control of their husbands. The Married Women Act, or acts actually, a series of acts beginning in 1870, for the first time recognized that right for women. It looks like the idea of Mrs. So-and-so seemed to be a carryover from the period where women did not have a legal entity on their own. So it has to be the husband who controlled the wealth of the family. Here we're talking about Britain, who's much ahead of other European countries. You know, in Switzerland and other places, some of the rights of women were only recognized in the 50s, and some even lingered after that. But you're talking here about the 19th century, almost 1300 years before that. That right was very well established in Islam, and as you know, Prophet Muhammad himself was a business manager to his wife Khadija, who was the real owner of her own wealth. But the second point that sometimes lead to misunderstanding, that some people say that the worth of woman in Islam is half that of man because she inherits, in most cases, by the way, it's not always the case. There are cases where they get the same share. It depends on the degree of relationship to the deceased and so on. But in most cases, other factors being equal, the male inherits twice as much, and as such, her worth is regarded as half. This is exactly similar to the example that I gave you earlier, that you have an equivalent of 1,000 British pound. I have the equivalent, but I say I am superior to you because I came from Canada and I happen to have more Canadian dollars. I get 70 Canadian out of that 1,000, you get 35. I am superior. That's very superficial, isn't it? Because the total is the same, really. So usually when things, again, are taken out of their context, it looks like unfair. But when you consider the financial security and privileges given to women, not men, you find that they are being even more favored than men. When the woman, first of all, is free to own property by way of inheritance or earning, when she gets married, the entire property remains her possession. She doesn't have to spend a penny out of that. In marriage, the marital gift is paid by the husband, not the wife, as we find in some non-Muslim cultures or some Muslim culture that has been influenced by non-Muslim cultures. It is the husband actually who pays gifts and the marital gift. And the Qur'an says, nihla, which means a gift, a free gift. It's not to go to her parents or to appease her sisters or anything of that nature. It's her personal property. She doesn't have to spend a penny out of that. That during the marital life, she's not responsible for any expense whatsoever, including her own food and clothing and accommodation. And the wealth she acquires or inherits is totally for her own security. And then you get all the guarantees in divorce, the support during the waiting period, which could extend to 9 months if she's pregnant, child support after divorce. Some jurists say that even 1 year support should be provided unless she remarries during that period. In that perspective, then, you see that actually women has been even given greater financial security in consideration of their femininity and the fact that if they have children, they might sacrifice earning money in order to raise their children, so they deserve that additional security. One more point I wanted to add to what is there in the outline also that I think is quite relevant in the West, that in principle there is no prohibition on women working. In other words, it's not haram for women to work. What is forbidden to both genders. If working in a bar, for example, serving drinking is haram for male, it's haram for female, for both of them. What is required to sustain life, then it will be required of both if there is no support, if there is no Islamic support to provide. And this is very practical because some sisters in America, for example, accept Islam. They might be divorcees, they might have children to support, and there's no support financially from the community, and as such they have to work. But of course we have to keep in mind also that a married Muslim woman must secure the consent of her husband to work, because within the Islamic context, if she's giving all that financial security, it is only in return for devoting herself to the function that Islam values very greatly as a mother and homemaker, not housekeeper, homemaker and bringer of this new generation. So there has to be some understanding. However, within Islamic law, if a woman, for example, wishes to pursue a career and want to include that as a condition in her marital contract, that her husband will allow her to pursue the career or work within certain parameters, that's also acceptable in Sharia. But the main thing is the spirit of cooperation between husband and wife, the spirit of priorities that is Islamic rather than materialistic. But other than that, husband and wife may work out their problem together. There's no problem. One curious question that came to me in one session in the United States, I never expected that. One sister was asking me, can a husband in Islam force his wife to work because the income is not much? And that question really shouldn't arise in the first place. She's exempt. Nobody can force a female in Islam to work. Her father cannot force her to work. Her husband cannot force her to work. It is her own option if she wanted to work. But she cannot be forced to work in order to support the family. But that, again, I wanted to comment because you might have faced or heard some issues like that raised in a society that's similar to ours in North America. Okay, but moving on from there to the social aspect, again, I'll be very brief on areas that are obvious. The topic is divided in some sub-areas. The treatment as a daughter. All I wanted to emphasize beside points 1 through 4 in the outline is to clarify a complaint that many young women narrated to me in North America, and you might have a similar case here, that some people, in the name of Islam, in the name of preserving the family and so on, they impose restriction on girls, on the sons, but not daughters. The son, if he wants to go out and date and do all kind of things, the parents somehow claim or pretend they don't see and somehow consent to that. I'm not suggesting here that there should be equality in evil, that the daughters also should be allowed to go out dating. But all I am saying here that there's some kind of chauvinistic, strange attitude which is totally cultural, but sometimes presented in the name of Islam, that the boy can do whatever he wants, that the girl can't. Of course, the girl should be protected, should be safeguarded, because she's more vulnerable. Of course, you hear a lot more about girls being raped by males, not the reverse. It's seldom you hear the reverse. So, yes, there could be consideration, but it doesn't mean that the moral upbringing is different in terms of sons and daughters. In the second category or subsection under social, as a wife, that of course we will deal with inshallah tomorrow. But the part that probably will not be dealing with tomorrow is dissolution of marriage. I don't know why it was not included in the program, but I understand, of course, that you want to establish families rather than thinking about dissolution of families. Like I remember one time we were talking about the rules of divorce in our masjid in Halifax, and one bachelor brother said, "We have not even got married yet, how come we talk about divorce now?" Anyway, but I just wanted to clarify that also, because these are some of the questions posed to Muslims by way of challenge. A number of myths are circulating that in Islam only man has the right to divorce, and all he has to say, I divorce you 3 times, and that's it. It's just that simple, disposable wives, type of. I must clarify, however, that this is far from true. The question of I divorce you is just like saying a marriage in Christianity is very simple. All you have to do is stand before the priest and say, I do. You don't say I do unless you have already gone through a long process. This is the culmination, really. And those who say that do not really look carefully into the Qur'an when it provides steps in dealing with marital disputes, various steps, and we'll talk about that tomorrow inshallah also, between husband and wife in their private, without any cruelty or excess or abuse. There are 3 steps specified in the Qur'an. If it doesn't work, invoking the help or arbitration of representatives from both families. If it doesn't work, and all the signals seem to indicate that there is irreconcilable incompatibility, then you go through the first divorce, and even then there is the waiting period. They can return together within the waiting period without a new contract. I mean, there's very elaborate procedures. The fact that some people abuse it doesn't mean that this is what Islam really teaches. This is the question of I do or I divorce you. But the most important misunderstanding here about what is allegedly said by way of discrimination, that women are stuck with men, but men can dispose of them anytime. That's totally erroneous. There are a number of ways of dissolution of marriage in Islam. It could be by agreement of both sides. It could be by the unilateral will of the husband, yes. It could also be with the unilateral will of the wife without the approval of the husband, if that condition was included in the marriage contract in the first place. It is not stuck if the husband is abusing her, not supporting her, or is impotent. There are all kinds of reasons that are given. If there is a good cause and she goes to the family court judge, Muslim family court judge, he can rule marriage annulled or rule divorce between the 2 parties, even if the husband doesn't want it. But even the thing that a lot of people don't know, and I must say unfortunately some of the scholars overlook teaching that also in many Muslim countries, is the system of khula. I'm not encouraging it, by the way, and the Prophet discouraged using any dissolution of marriage for frivolous reason. But this is a legal right that everybody should be aware of. And that is the case where a wife even doesn't have a cause. There is no abuse on the part of the husband, but she has her own private reason that she cannot continue to live with the person. Private reasons. There is no abuse on his part. All she has to do simply is to offer him financial compensation, which is mainly the marital gift, which is fair enough because she's the one who's initiating that. There's no fault. And when he paid the marital gift, the assumption was for permanent life. So she has to compensate by returning that to him. If there is any dispute about the amount of khul' or divestiture, it could be also resolved by the judge. The other myth is the question of custody, that only men are given custody, and you hear all these stories, not without my children, and all this kind of stuff. In fact, in principle, in custody in Sharia, the first principle is the welfare and well-being of the child. But the second principle, that everything else being equal, there is actually inclination more toward the female side. For example, the mother is entitled to custody of the child until the age of about 6 or 7, according to many jurists. After that time, he or she are given the choice between staying with the mother or going with the father. Some jurists say that in the case of girls, they may remain in the custody of their mothers until they are adolescent, and some even say until they get married because they need the guidance of their mother more than their father. But of course, there may be cases where, in Western society in particular, where there may be a problem that the child might lose his deen, especially if the mother is not Muslim. But otherwise, the custody in principle is more inclined to female. One finer point to indicate that, they say, the jurists say that if neither mother or father are able or qualified to take custody of the child, you know who's next? They say the maternal grandmother take precedence over the paternal grandmother. So even 2 females, but one is double female because she's the maternal grandmother, take precedence over the paternal grandmother. So this is again another myth. The question, of course, that you face a lot is the question of polygamy, but more correctly polygyny, because polygamy means multiple wives or multiple husbands. But multiple wives strictly means polygyny. Multiple husbands is called polyandry. That, of course, you must have heard a lot about, and again, I am covering just in basic principle to open door for questions. But as you know, those who are familiar with the Islamic teaching series, in Album 4, there are several half-hour programs devoted to some details on that subject. But I just wanted to remind ourselves that polygyny was not introduced by Islam. Always people try to, if you give a student in high school, non-Muslim, a survey to connect the words that are most related, and you have Islam and polygamy, the line would be drawn clearly by almost all students. Islam and polygamy are the same. Like I sometimes jokingly say that sometimes you meet a non-Muslim and the first question, what religion you are? Answer, Muslim. Second question, how many wives do you have? Did you meet the requirement, the upper level of 4 wives? I have heard some people, by the way, who make an argument, some Muslims unfortunately, some are scholars, who make an argument that polygamy or polygyny is the basis and monogamy is the exception. And their basis for that is that they say many of the companions of the Prophet ﷺ actually had more than 1 wife. This is a very strange thing to put monogamy not as the norm, but as the exception. We must realize that Islam, the Quran of course does not say that explicitly that either monogamy or polygyny is the norm. But we all know that Islamic Sharia never requires a norm which is impossible. Something which is impossible cannot be a norm, is it? Now, if we assume that everybody would be a faithful Muslim in that particular definition and have 4 wives, you're assuming a demographic structure of 80% females and 20% males. So on the average, everyone can have 4 wives. Even if you take second wife only, you're assuming a 2/3 female and 1/3 males. And we all know that demographic structure of males and females within different countries and globally is quite close, with the females perhaps maybe 2 to 3 percentage point more than males. But it's not really 2/3. It's not 80% versus 20%. So that could not really be a norm. This is a very, very strange argument in my mind. But of course, as you know, the occasion of revelation of this ayah seemed to point, after the Battle of Uhud, where 70 Muslims were martyred at least, seemed to point some kind of direction of a more clean and practical way of dealing with situation, accentuating circumstances like that which may arise. But I'm not saying, of course, that it is only allowed under those conditions, but to give the spirit really behind it. And in terms of motherhood, I need not go much in detail on that. I think in the paper it's clear. And the following panel under 4th, as a sister in faith, I just wanted to make one comment on number 1. The hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ says, إِنَّمَا النِّسَاءُ شَقَائِقُ الرِّجَالِ, that women are the twin halves of men. You know, that has been sometimes understood to mean, shaqa'iq means in a sense of sisters. But I'm more and more inclined now to think of a better translation, which is twin halves rather than sisters. Because if the Prophet ﷺ meant to say that they are sisters, he could have used akhawatul rijal. He could use, there's lots of terminology to say that they are sisters, which is correct. But that's not really the intent of the hadith as it appears to me, wallahu alam. Allah knows best. But the word shaqa'iq, like shaq, when you have something and you split it half. So you're talking the twin half. That's quite a profound statement. Because it is a logical contradiction to say there is a better half, except of course in the allegorical sense, or bigger half. Can you really talk about a bigger half? There's no bigger half. Twin halves means that that society is composed of both halves. Nobody can claim inherent superiority over the other. Of course, the final item under that is the hot issue of hijab and modesty. And my observation, aside from the points mentioned there, which you can read, it's no problem, is that a lot of writers in the West, especially feminist writers, and others for that matter, have for a long period of time upholding the idea that if a Muslim woman is wearing hijab, it's simply because there is some cruel male chauvinist who's holding a stick and ordering her to do that. So hijab is connected with force, oppression. She's forced to do that against her will, and is tantamount to ignorance, lack of education, and oppressive society in general. The big fault or flaw in that kind of so-called scholarly analysis is that it never really considered the phenomenon of women who were never raised in an Islamic society, who were born in Western society, whose values are quite different in terms of the matter of female dress. Yet when they become Muslims, they are even more adherent of the hijab. So the sociological reasons for hijabs are given. Economic reasons are given, that women do not want to spend too much on hairdo and things like that, so it's good for poor women. That it's fashion, all kind of sociological, economic reasons. Never I have seen in Western writing recognition of the religious factor. A woman who does that out of her own conviction, even though she was not raised like that, her society does not accept it, and she was never really raised in a culture. They always think of Muslim women in hijab as people who are just coming from some other old country, traditional Muslim country. And I can't understand what is the big fuss about that hijab in France and in Quebec. Also it happened in Canada, a couple of incidents also, the disease that seemed to have been imported from elsewhere. Yeah, that's right. I just want to add two more points on the social aspect before moving to the final item, because they're not included in the outline, but they're hot issues also, controversial, and there are lots of things about it. They were raised during the population conference in Cairo. They are constantly raised in the West about female circumcision, which in the radical form actually is given or dubbed as genital mutilation, which may be true. And a lot of people, until recently, there are some writers now and journalists who are realizing that they were mistaken in the sweeping statement that they were making, that this is something which is unique to Muslim societies and required by Islam, and it is one of those signs of oppressing women. All of these notions are mistaken. I think more and more research and information is being made available now to show that female circumcision, especially radical one, is something which is common in some cultures regardless of religion. In certain parts of Africa, it is just as rampant, like in southern Sudan and other places, as rampant among Christians as it is found also among Muslims. But the point that we should emphasize, again, since we don't care whether a practice is rampant here or there, except of course that it's wrong, but I mean that does not make it Islam, is the fact that this is not really required. It is only failed circumcision which is highly encouraged for males in Islam. In fact, I may narrate a hadith here, and I hope you don't mind, because again, we should not be too much shyness in learning about deen. In fact, if there is a reference to that in hadith, it's quite revealing. It is said that Prophet Muhammad ﷺ passed by a woman who was making a circumcision for a young girl, and he said to her, أشمي ولا تنهكي فإن ذلك أنظر للوجه وأحظى عند الزوج أو كما قال. He said, you know, when you do it, Ashimmi means just cut very little, like the outer skin, not the organ or anything, just the outer part of the outer skin. وَلَا تُنْهِكِ, don't cut any deeper. And he gave very interesting reason that shows the sensitivity of himself and sensitivity of Islam in general to the legitimate enjoyment of both genders. Because he said that is better for the freshness of the face and good also in relationship to the husband. What could be a more sensitive expression like that? So with this all big outcry about the radical thing that's taking place, we must say that it's totally un-Islamic, even though the Prophet did not outright forbid it, but the limitation he put seemed to be quite indicative that it has nothing to do with the thing that people complain about, which is very much sensationalized in the media. The other thing that perhaps we can take a rain check until tomorrow, since we talk about marriage tomorrow, is the issue of interfaith marriage. So maybe just to make it briefer, and you're tired and traveling, so we'll abbreviate and just move directly to the final item, Again, I'm not going to repeat much, and I hope you feel that these brief points, brief as they may be, I mean, they're quite clear, hopefully. I think the only question that sometimes arises is with respect to witness. When some people, again, try to make the wrong conclusion and think that they find consistent evidence against the Qur'an, inherits half, and again, 2 women witness for 1 man, so the same persistent downgrading of women and considering them half worth the man. Nothing really is further from truth, because if you survey the ayat in the Qur'an that deal with testimony or witness, you will find that the great majority of these ayat do not specify any number of men or women, except that the basic rule that you have 2 witnesses, but no specification. And then you find that in Surah An-Nur, Surah 24, it explicitly indicates that the witness of men and women in the case of mutual accusation of adultery, that's in the case of mula'ana, is exactly the same. Go and read it, Surah 24, exactly the same. And that destroys any base of a general rule that women witness is less. The only ayah in the Qur'an that required either 2 men witnesses or 1 man and 2 women is the one that deals with financial contracts. Again, this is the primary source of Islam. Secondary source, jurists differed as to whether that should be taken as a general rule, should be extended to some areas or the others. But you find that among jurists, like Imam al-Tabari, the famous mufassir of the Qur'an and historian, he said that there is no direct evidence that we can point to in the Qur'an or Sunnah that bar a Muslim woman from any position, even as a judge in any area of law. And as you know, the judge is more than a witness, because it is the judge who evaluates the worth of the witness itself. So it's a matter really of jurisprudential interpretation. One cannot say Islam say that. And furthermore, as some jurists put it, they say that this is not like the text pertaining to ibadah, that you follow it as it is because there's a wisdom behind it. Because the Qur'an itself gives the reason. If one of them forget or get confused, the other one would remind her. And talking to one of the well-known jurists, he said that it is the duty of the Muslim judge to evaluate also the witness of people, whether they are male or female. Just to give you an example, suppose the only 2 witnesses available is 1 man and 1 woman who is a graduate of a School of Business, and the other male is, unlettered person who happened to be male, who doesn't know much about business or the jargon. Which one really would have inherent value? So the ijtihad of the judge also, and his judgment and evaluation of the worth and competence of witnesses is a matter also that should be taken into account. So a great deal of mileage has been made out of that, even though the issue really is much more simple than people put it. The other aspect that I thought also may clarify the issue of the headship of the state. As you know, the great majority of jurists are of the opinion that a Muslim woman should not really be in a position of head of state. Again, like I said, the issue is frivolous again. Because you see, in a country that has 100 million people, like Pakistan, for example, what difference does it make whether, theoretically, I'm not talking Islam, theoretically, what difference does it make whether any person, male or female, is eligible to be a president, or whether it is only among males? It is a different chance of 1 out of 50 million versus a chance of 1 out of 100 million. I mean, the issue sometimes is blown out of proportion, but just for the sake of intellectual honesty, and this inshallah will be coming in some detail in that little book, I must say that there are still dissenting opinion even on the matter of a woman being head of state. If you go to the Qur'an, there is no direct reference barring women from being heads of state. I'm not saying that I call for that. I'm simply saying, honestly speaking, no text in the Qur'an, the first primary source, support that. Some people refer to the ayah in the Qur'an that says that men are responsible or maintainers of the family. But that, and they said if the husband is the head of the family, then obviously he should also be the head of the state. But even if you agree with the conclusion, I don't agree with the reasoning. It's a very weak reasoning, because the ayah that deals with leadership deals with the family arrangement, which involves social as well as economic relationship. But the argument has been better based on the hadith narrated by Abi Bakr, not Abu Bakr, the companion, it's another person, Abi Bakr, in the battle of the camel, when he said, I heard the Prophet ﷺ said, when he heard that the Persians appointed a queen to be the head of the state, he said, people will not succeed when they have a woman as their leader, but leader here does not leader in any respect. Leader means head of state in that particular context. The majority of Muslim jurists, with good reason, interpret that to mean that it's not really to say that women cannot qualify to be heads of state. There are a lot of women who can do a much better job than the lousy job done by the male leaders of Muslim countries today. There's no question. But perhaps for other reasons, in terms of the duties of the head of the state, sometimes leading the prayer, leading the armies, meeting privately with the heads of other states or their representatives who are mostly males in privacy, which is not very much with the etiquette. There are a number of reasons that they gave. But for the sake of intellectual honesty also, I must say that there are some scholars also who disputed that interpretation. Inshallah, again, like I said, there will be details on that. And some of the grounds they gave is that this could have been a statement, but not necessarily a categorical statement that applies to all circumstances and all cases, but may be applicable to societies where men give up their duty and their responsibility in the external function of society, that women are the ones who are running the society rather than paying attention to the function they can do best as mothers and wives, with the roles complementary between both sides. Abu Ya'la al-Farra, who is well known for his writings on the system of government in Islam, when he discussed the conditions that should be there as qualification for the head of the state, he did not include the question of gender. And some people like Zafir al-Qasimi and Muhammad Izza Darwaza made an argument, perhaps, that the unanimity that Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni once said, that all the ulama agreed unanimously that women cannot be head of state, is not really as unanimous as is claimed to be. Now, I'm not necessarily propagating this idea, and I think it's reasonable, but I'm saying that theoretically speaking, one cannot really have a very conclusive basis for that. Nor should we simply try to push women to be heads of state in order to say to the West, look, we are modernized, we are also advanced, our women are heads of state. Because in the few cases where we have some women as heads of state, unfortunately they are not committed women, but secular type of women, which is even more damage to the Islam and the Muslim Ummah. But I thought, at least for honesty, I must bring to your attention that there is even dissent in that particular issue. But you can. There was a question, by the way, we're not ducking it. It's about some hadith about women.
Could you please explain the Islamic analogy of a woman being likened to a rib?
Well, first of all, there is no text that I know of that really is analogous to what you find in the Bible, for example, talking explicitly that God took Adam, let him sleep, and then when he was sleeping he took a rib, and out of that he made a woman. We don't find such an expression really in the Quran or hadith of the Prophet ﷺ. However, there is one hadith that I was planning to cover tomorrow on this controversial hadith, but since it was asked, it's one of the brief ones that we can address quickly. The Prophet ﷺ begins the hadith, and that's significant, by saying, "Istawsu bin nisa'i khayra." I commend you to be good to women, to be kind. That means to women. He says, for a woman is created from a curved rib. I prefer to use the term curved rather than crooked. A'waj in Arabic. The word crooked has a very negative connotation. But actually, curved is a better word. Curved rib. A'waj, it's not straight. It has its curvature. And then he says, the most curved part of the rib is the top of it. And if you go to try to straighten it, you will break it. So they asked him, what is breaking the rib? He said, divorce. And then the hadith ends, فَاسْتَوْصُوا بِالنِّسَاءِ. Therefore, I commend you to be kind to women. What does that mean? Of course, like I said, in the traditional mistaken interpretation, women are crooked and men are straight. No, it doesn't mean that at all. It means basically that the nature, the inherent nature of men and women, while similar in many respects, are not identical. And this is nothing to say that one is superior to the other. Example, some studies have been reported, actually in one recent issue of the Time magazine, that on the whole, males do better in mathematics. Women do better in arts and language, for example. It's not that one is superior to the other. There's diversity in the skills available. But suppose even that doesn't prove to be false. That's not the issue really. But basically, it says that men, for example, may, in most circumstances, think in a more rational or objective way, or just like straightforward type of thing. Women tend to be more artistic. The notion of feeling and emotion is very much there. That's why you have them more in arts. Okay? So their curvature is different from men in terms of decision making. And since the hadith begins and ends by commending people to be kind to women, it means that you should consider their nature and don't try to force them against their nature. The curve is like that, but you say, I must make that rib straight, forcing her against her will to think and act like you, man, that is not appropriate. You should accept the variations in nature. That is the way I understand the hadith, which is consistent with other ayat and hadith in the Quran that never attributed crookedness to one gender or the other. Okay, so much for that. I'd like just to come to some conclusion in this highly capsulized presentation, or not so capsulized, that we have to really be honest with ourselves and with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Never to defend something which is done by Muslims, individuals or countries, simply because they are Muslims. We have to be steadfast, adhering to the truth, especially the things that are clear in the primary sources of Islam. We should never hesitate to say it quite clearly and honestly to Muslims and to non-Muslims alike, that this practice, even though many Muslims, even most Muslims are doing, is not Islam. And that the struggle, real struggle really should be towards the pure Islam, Islam which is wasat, means best, not extreme in one side or the other, following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ and the model of the early Muslim community. I hope that this will set the tone, inshallah, for dealing with the specifics of the family, in the hope that this would be the underlying attitude in the perception of role of men and women in society. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum.